8 mice entered a perfect world. 4 males, 4 females. Unlimited food, unlimited water, no predators, no disease, no obvious threat anywhere. Then, less than 5 years later, the entire society was dead. Not because they ran out of food, not because a disease swept through the colony. Something stranger had happened. The mice had stopped being mice. This was Universe 25, and what happened inside it became one of the most disturbing experiments ever conducted on animal society. In 1968, American researcher John Calhoun created what was supposed to be the ultimate mouse paradise. The temperature stayed stable. Food never ran out. Water never ran out. The animals had safe places to sleep, nesting material and protection from predators. Nothing outside the enclosure could hurt them. And there was nowhere to escape to. The enclosure was built inside a research facility in Maryland. It contained a maze of connected living spaces, ramps, tunnels, feeding stations, and nesting areas. Calhoun had designed the environment so that physical survival was almost effortless. The mice didn't have to hunt. They didn't have to migrate. They didn't have to search for water. They didn't have to defend themselves from anything trying to eat them. All they had to do was live. And at first, that's exactly what they did. The 8 founders explored their new world. They learned where to sleep. They learned where to eat. They established their territories. And then the first babies arrived. The population began multiplying. Every few weeks there were more mice, more bodies, more nests, more activity. By day 315, hundreds of mice were living inside the enclosure. The world that had seemed enormous to 8 animals was becoming very different with hundreds, but there was still plenty of food. There was still plenty of water. And according to the design, there was still enough physical space. So what could possibly go wrong? That was the question Calhoun was about to get an answer to. In a normal mouse colony, population pressure creates an escape valve. Young animals can leave. They can move into new territory. They can establish new nests. They can find new places to live. Universe 25 had no escape valve. There was no forest outside, no new territory, no distant corner where a young mouse could start over. Every mouse was trapped inside the same social world, and that created a problem that food could not solve. There were only so many places in the colony for a mouse to belong, only so many territories, only so many nests, only so many social roles. The mice were beginning to run out of something much harder to measure than food. They were running out of places in the society. Young males began drifting toward the center of the enclosure. They didn't establish territories. They didn't compete for females. They didn't seem interested in defending anything. They simply gathered together. They ate. They slept. They moved around. And when another mouse attacked them, some barely responded. They would absorb the attack, walk away, then lie down again. But while some males became passive, others went in the opposite direction. They became increasingly aggressive. They entered nests that belonged to other males. They disrupted established territories. They pursued females without following the normal social patterns. The colony was splitting into strange behavioral extremes. Some mice seemed unable to participate. Others seemed unable to stop participating. And neither behavior looked healthy. The females began changing too. Some climbed toward the highest apartments in the enclosure. There, away from much of the colony, they isolated themselves. They interacted less. They reproduced less. The social system that had once connected the colony was beginning to fracture. And then something even darker happened. The mothers began failing. Raising pups required more than food. It required protection, recognition, social stability, a functioning environment around the nest. But the colony no longer had that. Some mothers abandoned their young. Some failed to care for them properly. Some became aggressive toward their own offspring. The number of pups surviving to weaning collapsed in some parts of the colony. The mice still had everything they needed to stay alive, but they were losing the ability to raise the next generation. And then came the strangest generation of all. The young mice that survived grew up inside a society that was already breaking apart. They had never experienced the old colony. They had never learned the social roles that once kept it functioning. They didn't fight. They didn't compete for territory. They didn't court females. They didn't seem interested in reproducing. They mostly ate. They slept. And they groomed themselves. Their fur was immaculate. They looked healthy, almost perfect. Calhoun called them the beautiful ones. But underneath their perfect appearance was something deeply disturbing. They had withdrawn from the colony completely. They weren't sick, they weren't starving, they weren't injured. They simply stopped participating. The colony was producing animals that could survive physically while abandoning the behavior required to continue the species. The population eventually reached its peak. Around 2,200 mice were now living inside Universe 25. And then the growth stopped. Not because the food disappeared. Not because the water disappeared. The births simply began disappearing. The last successful conception eventually occurred. After that, no new generation could replace the animals already living inside the enclosure. The colony began aging. The beautiful ones kept grooming themselves. The isolated females remained withdrawn. The remaining aggression continued in scattered pockets. But there was no future behind it. Every death now brought the colony closer to the end, and there was nothing coming behind them. On May 23, 1973, the last mouse in Universe 25 died. The experiment had lasted almost 5 years. The physical death of the colony was obvious, but Calhoun believed something had happened much earlier. He described the colony as experiencing 2 deaths. The first was the death of the social and behavioral structure. The second was the death of the bodies themselves. By the time the final mice died, the colony had already lost the behaviors that allowed a mouse society to reproduce itself. The strange part was that the environment had never stopped providing the basics. Food was still available. Water was still available. Shelter was still available. The paradise was still there. The society wasn't. The obvious explanation became famous. Too much comfort, too much abundance, too little struggle. But that interpretation misses the more disturbing idea Calhoun was exploring. The problem wasn't simply that life had become easy. The problem was that the colony had become unable to provide enough meaningful roles for its members. There were more mice than meaningful places for mice to fit into the social structure. The fighters had nothing useful to defend. The young had no new territory to inherit. The mothers struggled to maintain functioning families, and the next generation grew up without a working model of what its life was supposed to be. The colony still had resources. What it was losing was structure. Calhoun didn't spend the rest of his career simply warning that paradise was dangerous. He kept experimenting. He kept changing the conditions. He wanted to understand whether a society could avoid the collapse. And eventually his thinking moved towards something far more interesting. If physical space becomes limited, perhaps the answer isn't simply finding more physical space. Perhaps societies survive by creating new roles, new ideas, new forms of cooperation, new things for people to build, new reasons to participate. Calhoun called this ideational generativity. The phrase sounds complicated. The idea isn't. A society needs the ability to keep creating places for its members to matter. Because Universe 25 wasn't really a story about mice running out of food. It was a story about what happened when they ran out of somewhere to belong. And that's what makes the experiment so disturbing. The mice couldn't leave. They couldn't redesign their world. They couldn't create new territory. They couldn't choose a different future. We can. And whatever happens next depends on what we choose to build. And that's the strange part. The mice had everything they needed to survive. What disappeared was the reason to participate. Like the video, subscribe so you don't miss stories like this, and share your thoughts in the comments.